Hello and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me on another of my wonderful interviews. Now, it's been a long time since my guest that I have for you has been on the show. It was right, I suppose, at the beginning of my journey into what the hell is going on in the world and who are these people who want to do you know what to us. And by golly, they don't seem to have stopped. However, I have been so much more aware of the skies, and I've spoken to many more people who are equally aware, and yet not everybody is still aware. So but I think we're getting there. It is a great privilege to bring back to the show Dane Wigington from geoengineeringwatch.org. Dane, fantastic to have you back on the show. Thank you for joining me. It must have been about 6 or 7 months ago that we were, yeah.
In that range, and thank you for your continued attention to what's occurring in our skies. The gravity and immediacy of the threat posed by the ongoing aerosol operations and all that they entail can't be overstated.
No, absolutely. And it seems to be, I mean, so bleeding obvious now. I mean, only the other day, I came out, it was morning, and I came out of my house. It was a nice day, but to the east of me was cloud, and there were these straight lines going like this, right across, bang, bang, one after the other. And now I live on the coast, and we have planes, we have two airports sort of within 50 and maybe 80. So Gatwick Airport, Heathrow, and they always go over. And on this particular day, they were going over, and there were these streaks, which was very unusual in this sort of formation. And it was sort of 8:30 in the morning, rush hour, people are walking. And I just stood there and I just started to say, look up, to these people. I said, look. And a few people thought I was a bit mad. And as I went on, a few people did look up, and I said, isn't that a bit weird? And a few people did look and went, do you know, I've never noticed that before. So just, trying to plant the seed, I was going, don't you think that's weird? Isn't it weird how it today, and yet normally we don't see that, or we do, but it's not so prominent. So you've made me so aware of what's going on, and now once you see it, you can't not see it.
That's correct. And again, the quote condensation trail narrative that so many have accepted without a moment's research. And on that point, when we have up close film footage of these aircraft at altitude, nozzles visible, turning on and off, that's the end of the discussion. This is not condensation. And as you know, geoengineeringwatch.org has, from our film The Dimming, which has been posted for free the moment it was done on our homepage, we took a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration flying lab to altitude, top scientist in it, sampled what these aircraft were emitting, and found what we knew we would find, starting with climate engineering elements, aluminum nanoparticles, highly, highly toxic, not just to us, but to all life, period, no exceptions. Aluminum doesn't exist in the environment naturally in free form. People need to understand that. When you have even those from so-called academia claiming that aluminum is a very abundant element in Earth strata, which is true, but it's always bonded to other elements, period. No exceptions. If it's in free form, that means it's been mined, refined, and dispersed, and that's exactly what we found. And so listeners understand that nanoparticle form is highly toxic of any element, let alone aluminum, heavy metals like aluminum and
Yeah.
mercury. So the smaller the particle, the more toxic it is, the more bioavailable it is, the more bioaccumulative it is. It's building up in every single one of us. Doesn't matter whether people believe it or not. Everyone we've tested, hair, blood, urine, is packed full of these metals. And I'll leave it with this, Richard. These metals, although I'm sure your listeners know aluminum is highly toxic, most people do. Mercury, they know, is toxic. When you mix those two metals, when you combine them, you get what's called synergistic toxicity. And the overall toxicity, in case of those two metals, we have peer-reviewed study to prove this, the overall toxicity can increase as much as 10,000%,
Wow.
100 times worse. It's mind-numbing. And now let's add the other metals, strontium, barium, manganese, polymer fibers, surfactants. Now we know we have graphene. I'm not sure if you and I discussed that, because that was something we've found in
No.
our recent lab test. Last 100 plus lab tests, all almost without exception, had graphene in the rain. Again, that can't be there unless it was put there. So we have an atmosphere that's basically a physics lab for those in power, and we will all pay the price if it continues.
And it's coming. I mean, not only is it sort of dimming the sky, but it is coming down. We're breathing it in. But now I've noticed if you skim your finger on your vehicle, you're getting this strange dark substance, which isn't just ordinary dust.
No, it's not. In fact, it's many people, even just citizens in the field, have now done their own tests with magnets on scraping up that material off their windshields and so forth. It's magnetic. And so, again, people need to understand those in power can do and are doing whatever they want. There's nothing to hold them back. There's no regulation, there's no oversight. And we know in regard to biological testing and biological warfare, we just had in California, media covered this. Much of the state was blanketed in filaments that they blamed on spiders. Would have been trillions of spiders to do this. Some of these filaments were hanging off of street signals and signposts. They were 30 feet long. So are we to believe spiders somehow did that? And if there's so many spiders to simultaneously blanket the state in these filaments that look much like the artificial spider webs people use on Halloween here, it looks the same, but the material itself is very different. It's very adhesive, and they would have us believe this is some coordinated effort by trillions of spiders, and they couldn't identify or show us a single one, not one. We know climate engineering operations name polymer fibers as a specific element for various purposes to keep the other particles aloft longer. And we tested some of this material at geoengineeringwatch.org in a previous event that happened in my region, and much of this material was aluminum. So unless spiders are weaving their webs out of aluminum and somehow mysteriously can't be found, the whole story is preposterous. And this is the dark side of this, Richard. We know that polymer fibers are used militarily for biological warfare to carry a pathogen from the clouds to the ground. The same is true for graphene. We know
Right.
these elements in our rain. If that doesn't alarm people, it should.
Absolutely, it should. And now, I've since we spoke, people have sent me obviously more stuff because they've been more aware of it, and they were aware that I was interested in it. And about a month later, somebody sent me a link to the British government website. And there it was, a paper on geoengineering that had been sort of dismissed, and people saying, "Oh no, the government are not involved in any of this," and I've started to see this anywhere. So it's at first it sounded like to me and my viewers that it was something that nobody was talking about, and thanks to people like yourself knew about it. But now they're admitting they're doing it, and they're pretending that this is the way to combat climate change by reflecting the sunlight back. Can you tell us more about the narrative that they're putting?
Yes, the scientific terms are stratospheric aerosol injection, solar radiation management, cloud albedo enhancement. The layman's term, the chemtrails term, again, we caution people against using that term if you're talking to an elected official or media or official agency, because that's the instant marginalization term, because there's no scientific definition or basis for the term, even though it's very descriptive and
Right.
accurate. So stick to the science terms. Stated purpose, solar radiation management, to fill the sky with light scattering particulates to deflect some of the sun's incoming thermal energy. Now, with that kind of myopic approach, what can they do and what are they doing? They can and are, and this is only, again, the stated purpose, and this is only one layer of this issue. There are many, many layers, and I want to make this clear. There is no benevolence in these programs, zero.
Mm.
That is simply a cover for ongoing weather warfare, biological. Again, we have to consider biological warfare with the elements we know are in this mix because we know they're toxic. And there's no regulation to prohibit what they're doing by design. So when they fill the sky with these light scattering particles, which we know is occurring from our testing, and we have film footage, what does that do to the atmosphere? It destroys the ozone layer for a starter. And we know from last week's publications from many institutions, your listeners can verify everything I'm saying, that the ozone hole over Antarctica that supposedly was getting all better is at record levels now. And this is not even a disclosure on how the ozone layer is around the rest of the world, Richard, which we have a former NASA contract engineer that works directly with us with state-of-the-art equipment that we supplied him that's metering the UV radiation that's bombarding our planet. That's a direct reflection of the condition of the ozone layer. And he sent me a message, incredibly dire, only a few days ago at the continued deterioration of the ozone layer. It waxes and wanes, but its overall damage is so horrific that he estimates that we may face functional ozone collapse in as little as 2 to 3 years. That would mean no more food growth, no more plankton. And we're getting right now, today, extraordinarily high levels of UVC on the surface. So for the UV spectrum, we have UVA, UVB, UVC, and then X-ray. We're told that 95% of incoming UV radiation, I'm trying to get at some of the consequences here. Forgive me for departure, but this is important.
No, no, no. You carry on.
We're told 95% of incoming UV radiation is UVA, 5% UVB, and we're told UVC is stopped 100,000 feet up by the ozone layer. So if we're getting such high UVC, we know the deterioration of the ozone layer now is extraordinary. And when they meter UV, Richard, and this is important because people think if this was true, we would see this in the UV metering, and that is completely false. What we see them metering is only half of the UVB spectrum and none of the UVC. You can't find what you're not looking for. The same is true with the particulate matter. Aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese, polymer fibers, surfactants, they're not looking for any of that.
Right.
Of course, they're not going to find it and disclose it. Further, Richard, you've probably heard them talk about how bad the air quality is, and now the PM 2.5 microns, that this is a very dangerous particle level because it's smaller, and they're disclosing that. What aren't they disclosing? Nothing, zero in the nanoparticle range. The mountain of material that's coming down on us from climate engineering operations that we estimate from rain sample extrapolations somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 million tons annually around the world. None of that being disclosed or even monitored or looked for by official air quality testing. So again, we are sinking in a sea of lies, and our planet, our biosphere, is now a toxic fishbowl. We're not going to be around long if we remain in the current course. It's life support systems, ecosystems around the globe are absolutely collapsing, from fisheries to crops.
And I mean, the thing that the big question, of course, that one wants to pose, and I'm almost fearful to pose this in one respect, is what can we do to stop it?
That boils down to a critical mass of awareness so that populations understand they're fighting for their lives. Football games, politics, electrical devices, which many can't seem to look up from, none of that will matter soon in the current course. And let me back this up with statistical data, because I want people to understand the severity of what we face right now. We've had recent peer-reviewed study of plankton populations in the Atlantic Ocean down 90%, according to that study. Other oceans not far behind. Global insect populations down 80 to 90%. Global wildlife populations have declined 70% in the last 40 years alone. The current rate of species loss, we face a statistical 0 hour for no functional wildlife populations as soon as 2026. That doesn't mean there's no animals left. It means their populations are no longer functional. They're declining so rapidly that their demise is imminent at that point. Forests, we've lost 2/3 of the tree cover that existed on the planet before the dawn of civilization. 2/3. In fact, in Canada alone this year, and this on the epic fires, Richard, and that's happened since we last spoke, those we can almost completely hang around the neck of climate engineering, period. It is cutting off precipitation, toxifying soils and water, so soil microbiome is slaughtered. Root systems detect this toxin in the rain, so they shut down nutrient uptake. The destroyed ozone layer is frying the tree foliage, causing trees to shut their stomata, their respiratory ports, so they can't breathe, they can't absorb carbon, they can't release oxygen. None of the so-called environmental groups talking about this, by the way. But if we look at how much we've lost, and again, I'm trying to give a global picture, The fires in Canada alone this year were about 72,000 square miles of loss. It's bigger, about 10,000 square miles larger than the entire surface area of Florida. And very few people understand how much forest actually burned. And again, with climate engineering, whatever the agenda, whatever the objective, we can say definitively that that is the single biggest factor with the fires, whatever the source of ignition. That's a
Right.
separate subject as well. And it appears there's coordinated arson involved with this in perhaps numerous forms. But what is setting the template for these fires to burn with such ferocity? And that is climate engineering, period. And I'll leave it with this. We located at geoengineeringwatch.org a 140-page U.S. military document titled Forest Fires as a Military Weapon. We also, that's posted on our site. Your listeners can examine that. It describes everything I just described, how they prep the forest by cutting off the precipitation. These particles are also desiccants, by the way. Aluminum nanoparticles they're desiccants. They dry out the foliage. They're also incendiaries. Aluminum
Right.
nanoparticles are such a powerful incendiary that they're used in demolition materials from every conceivable direction. This is contributing to the fires. So these factors were part of Lahaina, which has happened since we last spoke. We know atmospheric conditions set the template for that fire to burn with such ferocity. That's directly related to climate engineering. So, and one final factor, we found peer-reviewed study advocating for the intentional burning of northern latitude forests to mimic the temporary cooling effects of a volcano by putting enough particulate matter in the air to provide temporary cooling. So when all the Canada fires started, what did we see? That smoke with atmospheric pressure manipulation was pushed down over the US Northeast, lowered their temperatures by 30 degrees. But think of the level of insanity with that, to incinerate the planet's last remaining life support systems for their purposes. And we now have in open discussion in some circles in Washington the proposed benefit of a limited nuclear exchange to do the same thing, to mimic the temporary cooling effects of a volcano, that actually advocated for a limited nuclear exchange. And Richard, is that what they're moving toward right now in the Middle East?
Well, everything's looking very bleak, and as you say, it's all wound up ever since we spoke, sort of 6, 7 months ago. And the other question that comes to mind is, they, let's say whoever they are, is this part of the depopulation of the planet, or is this actually just to wipe out everything on the planet? What's the agenda behind the madness that we see and think is just totally irrational?
All good questions, all important questions. Let's start with the they. Who are they? They are those who print the money, those who
Right.
control the central bankers. Thus, they control militaries. Thus, they control countries. Thus, they control media. That's the they we're talking about here. Elected officials mean nothing, absolutely nothing. It's simply a form of distraction. And as you see, the political theater in the U.S. is, and UK, same. I mean, it simply distracts populations. In regard to agendas and objectives, the same they we're discussing here, based on psychoanalysis, and this is from very uh, confirmed study of their personality types. There's a common thread, and that's a near total lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. Does a
Right.
drug addict care if their next fix will kill them? They don't. We're talking about power addicts in this case. They will do anything to retain that power, regardless of the consequences. And we have examples of that, Richard. We have the 2,400 nuclear detonations that have happened around the world. That contaminated everything, including them. The execution of Project Starfish Prime. If your listeners don't know what that is, they can look it up and look at the videos. That's the U.S. military's detonation of hydrogen bombs in the magnetosphere that they thought could collapse the atmosphere. They did it anyway because there was no one to stop them from doing it. And we're still dealing with the repercussions from those detonations today. And nuclear power plants, we have Fukushima, triple nuclear meltdown, no technology to fix it, no end in sight. And they're dumping the water in the Pacific right now, as you know. And Chernobyl is not done. That sarcophagus is disintegrating. We're building 60 more new plants. We have 442 online. I'm only pointing out we're dealing with a headless, heartless, soulless cancer that exists for its own proliferation, its own power, its own control. That's what we're dealing with. So back to your the other part of your question, are they intentionally trying to wipe out the web of life? We see no evidence at geoengineeringwatch.org that that is the specific intention. As far as culling human populations, we have more than enough data to confirm that that is absolutely part of the agenda. I mean, we
Mm.
could go into other subjects, but I think we all know what they are. And again, when we know at minimum the highly toxic nature of what's being sprayed on us, we know they know that, and they're doing it anyway. And we have other elements, again, in the mix that are used strictly for biological warfare. And let me give a little historical data. This is from the Washington Post that as of 1977, the US military had conducted no less than 239 open air biological tests on innocent, unknowing US populations. How much have they done since that time? So, again, I cite my sources on that. Your listeners can look up anything I'm stating.
Mm.
So, the bottom line is whatever people want to consider the agendas and objectives, this is real. This is ongoing. This is a very near term existential threat, greatest and most immediate threat we face short of nuclear cataclysm. And even there, Richard, this is connected because the damage to the atmosphere that I mentioned already. Now, if we have a major CME, a coronal mass ejection solar flare, that's going to shut down grids around the globe. That's going to mean nuclear plants around the globe can't cool themselves. Now we have Fukushima times two, 300, game over.
And that we've had predictions for that from next year or 2025. People have been talking about the second Carrington event, I think it's called,
Yes.
in which, yeah, and which of course there'll be no real escape, and people won't really be able to back. We'll lose everything, and digitally anyway, which everything is being pushed onto an electric and all of that, which will. And so, tell me what happens in the atmosphere if we have one of those, depending on the scale of it. What protection do we normally have, and the effects that the particles in the atmosphere would have? Would that increase it? Would it effectively make like a big bang of everything sort of fusing?
Depending on the nature of the CME, there are many potential effects, but the bottom line is we do not have the protection that we had in the 1800s during the Carrington event, starting with the ozone layer. So,
Right.
in fact, the NASA contract engineer that I mentioned in the message he wrote to me only a few days ago specifically brought up the CME potential and the fact that are so vulnerable now that that would be an immediate game over scenario. So it causes surges in electrical conductors, power lines, circuitry, shuts down all of that and damages that. So the bottom line is our delicately balanced, industrialized, militarized techno society would be dealt a death blow. And we have laid the template for that to happen. And this is back to those in power not considering the consequences of these actions even to themselves. I would argue that biosphere and ecological collapse, much of it further fueled by climate engineering. In fact, climate engineering is the single most destructive human activity at this moment. And that's saying a lot because we've been very poor stewards of the planet. Single most destructive human activity, greatest and most immediate threat we face short of a nuclear cataclysm, which again is connected. So what we're in quite a dark corner. And I stress this that even if we boil this down, Richard, to just what we're breathing in every breath we take,
Yeah.
that by itself, whatever a person's perspective is on environmental anything of the climate, and again, we have all the environmental groups ignoring this issue or pretending it's not happening. It's just a proposal, even though we can all see it with our eyes,
Mm.
because the 501 nonprofits depend on them not mentioning this. And we have no courage from any political candidate, any elected official. And let's all just pretend that we're not seeing what we're seeing in the sky. But we have recent peer reviewed study that concluded that we are inhaling, each of us, as many as 20 million nanoparticles in every single breath we take. That's very hard to believe or comprehend. Again, your listeners can look up anything I'm stating. The reason that can be possible is because you can fit 100,000 nanoparticles across the width of a single human hair. They are inconceivably small. And that's what makes them so dangerous, because they infiltrate through the olfactory nerve in your nasal passages. They go right into the blood stream. They cross the blood-brain barrier. They lodge in organs. This is an incredibly lethal mix. It's doing the same to the entire web of life. In fact, we're losing, and I'm not blaming everything on climate engineering. Again, we've done a lot of damage to the planet, but this is so radically and devastatingly affecting the planet's life support systems. We're losing right now 200 to 300 species of plant, animal, and insect to extinction every single day. Many of those species haven't even been identified yet. And articles about that this week out as well, that the giving the total number of species that is estimated to be in the planet, how few have been identified, and how many we're losing every day. And people are going about their lives, again, watching football games, pizza, beer, and pretending it's all going to work out. And that's not the case. And those in power are going to play much bigger cards. In fact, in recent days, they already are, as we see. I would argue that they're not going to stop.
Now, listen, Dane, you've been doing this for some considerable time, and you've been shouting from the rooftops as best you can. Mm-hmm. And I'll show your website in a minute. How does this affect you personally? Because the message is so damn serious, and you must find sometimes, you know, you're shouting into an empty room where nobody's listening, or those that are listening are going, yeah, we know that, Dane, we know that, and what can we do? How do you cope with it?
The only solace I've known, and thank you for asking, Richard, is to be fully engaged in this fight. That the knowledge that when I take my last breath, I'll be found manning my post. And for every single person, and this is when people claim that fighting a battle like this doesn't matter because they feel we can't win. I would argue that for every single people that my efforts, your efforts, the efforts of your followers, for every single person that we help to awaken, that we help expand their field of vision to see the wider horizon, however painful that might be, that effort matters in and of itself. Every single person we help to awaken matters. The quote collective unconscious, that this 100th monkey syndrome, if we could fully force this issue to the light of day, and populations all over the world understood what their so-called leaders have done to them without their knowledge, without their consent, and that we are in fact fighting for our lives and the lives of our posterity, because none of us will be here on the current trajectory if we remain on this. And this is, again, I want to point out, this is a statistical fact. It's not my opinion. When you have a car going 100 miles an hour, 10 feet from impact, you can say definitively, you can put the brakes on all you want. You're going to hit, and it's going to be very brutal. And that is the equation that we now face. But what life could have more meaning than doing everything one can in one's power to make a difference to those around you? And if they do the same, then suddenly we have this tidal wave of awareness. We could cause a shock wave around the world. So we have to prioritize. And that's what I've tried to do. That's the purpose of geoengineeringwatch.org. This is not a particular subject that I had some special interest in, other than the fact it's the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat. It's the hole that if we don't plug this hole, the whole boat goes down, and all other causes and concerns then become moot. So it's simply a rational matter of prioritization for me, and that's what has found me in this battle. And I simply can't walk through the forest, Richard, and watch the trees die, and they're dying here in absolute mass. In fact, the western fir for U.S. Western forest, the predominant tree, the die-off is so horrific that the most recent peer-reviewed study called it Firmageddon. That's how severe the die-off. They're all dying. All the firs are dying here, the predominant tree in the forest. So we face a near-term fight for life, and if that doesn't warrant our absolute attention and priority, then I don't know what does. And there is solace in facing it head on. There's no solace in tucking tail and running. Facing it head on and knowing you're doing all you can, there's solace in that.
So you say a global awareness would certainly help. What can people do? I mean, clearly people can write to their MPs in this country, but we know that sort of is a waste of time, except that it's, you know, the more press you put everywhere that you can and talk about it online. But what will an awareness do? Will these psychopaths who are doing this take the blind bit of notice?
Again, very important question. And going back to what you stated earlier, yes, when I started this battle, now some 20 years ago, I only heard my own voice coming back at me,
Right.
and no one listened to anything. But the more data I discovered and presented and made known, and now thanks to people like you and your voice, now we have a huge undercurrent of awareness on this issue. And many people, including military officers like those in the Dimming, we have two Air Force generals speaking out in the Dimming. We have former Canadian Minister of Defense, government scientists, former U.S. presidential cabinet members, as they became aware that they are indeed fighting for their lives, the lives of their family. Now, all these wheels begin to turn on their own. And at what point will, for example, the U.S. military, that's bigger than the next 10 biggest militaries combined, at what point will our military brothers and sisters realize they are being lied to? They're not doing anything benevolent. This is as malevolent as it can possibly be. At what point would they stand down when their families know what they are participating in, indeed their own demise? And
Right.
that's the potential to turn the tide, to alter the equation, to take a quantum leap in the right direction. And I don't want to paint an unrealistic picture. The planet we've known, the reality we've known, is done. It's not coming back. And that's a very difficult pill for people to swallow. They want the party to continue forever. But I would argue this: if we have any chance of salvaging anything so that anyone can make it through what's coming, are we not obligated to try? And an example I've given on that before, and I think people can relate to this: if their child was in a burning house and they had very little chance of saving their child, would they not try? Of
Yeah.
course they would. So again, that's the equation we face, and there is absolute meaning in that. And in a final example, if you're standing in the middle of the freeway at rush hour, are you better off turning your back to traffic or facing it? I think that answer's clear.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, let me just put up your webpage here so that people know exactly where to go. Just bear with me 1 second whilst I bring it up on the screen. Hang on a second. Where is it? Here we go. That should be there. And is it on there?
Yes, yes.
Oh, good. Oh, yeah, that's it. So, Geoengineering Watch, and is that 45 million visitors that you've had, over 45 million visitors looking at this?
Correct.
And that is a brilliant, absolutely amazing. And there's the film The Dimming. When was that made?
It's been about a year and a half. We've had total censorship. Facebook completely censors that film. In
Yeah,
fact, we filed a lawsuit because of that. But we're still up to closing in on 2 million views. And the various aspects of climate intervention, this picture you see there of the blotted out sky, again,
yeah,
the title of the dimming relates to a scientific term called global dimming. 20 to 30% of the sun's direct rays now no longer reach the surface of the planet, Richard. And that's a staggering amount. And we have industrialized pollution. Yes, that's true. But as far as atmospheric particulate matter, mathematically, the single greatest cause is climate engineering. That's the specific stated purpose of these operations. And one key aspect that most are completely unaware of, Richard, is the engineered cool downs with these operations with what's called chemical ice nucleating elements. It's chemical ice nucleating cloud seeding. So the clouds are being seeded with endothermic reacting elements. These are patented processes. We have the patents. What does all that mean? It means that they can, with seeding cloud moisture with these elements, turn what should have been a liquid precipitation event, i.e., rain, into snow or frozen material, or now the massive hail we see all over. Every storm creates hail now in the U.S., and some of it huge, 2, 3, 4 inch hail. And so, and that your listeners can search China.
hang on, just say that again. 2 to 4 inches of hail. I
Oh
mean,
yes,
that's
baseballs.
yeah,
Baseball.
baseball
Yes,
sized. Crikey, and you
yes.
wouldn't want that landing on your head.
It has done a lot of damage to not just houses and cars and crops, but if you're out in it, it's definitely dangerous.
Mm.
And some of those hailstones have been 6 and 7 inches on the extreme cases of the record size hail, but it's now becoming common 2 to 3 inch hail, and this is absolutely not historically normal. And we know these elements have chemical ice nucleating constituents in them, so we're not guessing. We've measured
No.
this material. Your listeners can search Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorm, and they can find Fox News covered it, MSNBC, The Guardian, everybody covered it. But if you mention it here, it's some sort of marginalized subject that you're not allowed to talk about. Obviously, it's going on. The Chinese scientists engineered several snowstorms over Beijing. They did a $2 or $3 billion worth of damage on the final round, and now they're not really discussing it openly, but they were then. This is in 2009. These articles are all over the internet. So when you see, for example, in the U.S., we see these flash cool downs. Denver, they use Denver a lot because Denver's in a basin. And when you
Right.
nucleate cloud moisture, you create a cold, dense layer of air that descends to the surface. It tends to sit in a basin, just like when you go into a market, Richard, and you have the frozen food section with no top on it. It's all sitting in a basin, but
Right.
everything's frozen. Same principle.
Yes,
So
keeping it all because the the heat rises
yep,
and cold stays down. Yeah.
correct. So in Denver, we've seen the temperatures, I believe, in every one of the last 5 years go in the spring. They'll have record warm 85-degree days. That's what happened last spring. 85 degrees to single digits in less than 24 hours. That's not nature. Nature doesn't do that. That's chemical ice nucleation. And we also have, because there's surfactants in this mix, and surfactants, for listeners that don't know, that's what makes soap soap. It affects the molecular tension of water molecules. And when they see foaming rain, if you see certain rains and there's a lot of foaming looking material running down gutters and streets, and that's surfactants. It should not be in our rain. It makes the snow, the frozen material, I don't want to dignify it by calling it snow, but it makes it extraordinarily slippery. So we see
Right.
these massive pileups, 100 cars, 120 cars. People who think they knew how to drive on snow now don't. It tends to make a heavy, clumpy material. It's not like a naturally nucleated snow. It's very different. I grew up in snow in the San Gabriel Mountains in Southern California. This material is completely different, and it tends to flash burn also. We measured on the Mount Shasta, which is an icon in California. We measured the early season snow several years ago. The ambient temperature had not been below 30 degrees yet, but that frozen material was 15 degrees. Now, how can that be?
Mm.
It can't be naturally. And if people think about their first aid kit, Richard, that can sit on their shelf for 20 years with a cold pack in it, you mix those chemicals together in the cold pack, you have ice instantly. Same principle on a much
Same
larger
principle.
scale. Mm-hmm.
Gosh, I mean, there is so much more to this, you know, because if you get into a conversation with somebody and you say, look, you know, and you start using the lazy expression of, say, chemtrails and things, and as you pointed out, we should not be using those terms because they very much become, you're a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist and all of that, rather than using more of the scientific things. But it is, you must be so amazed that people are not seeing it. You know, I mean, obviously 45 million people have come to your website have seen it, but when you think that there are nearly 8 billion people on the world, and intelligent, otherwise what you would deem to be intelligent people, and you try to gently have a conversation with this, and their eyes glaze over and they just roll their eyes. And yet, some of those people, if they've been around, say, 60, 70 years, must surely notice how different the skies look. I mean, when I'm traveling, thanks principally to you introducing it to me on the show, sort of, say, 7 months ago, and I see that sort of effect, like here in Worthing, where I am on the south coast, we have Pebbly Beach, but there's sand underneath. And when the tide goes out, you get that sort of ripple effect.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that layered in the sky. It doesn't look at all natural. You know, clouds don't sort of do this for miles and miles, as if this has been laid down by a big tide or something just washing back. And yet people don't see it.
Those are all profoundly important observations and questions, and thank you for that. And going back to the how perplexed and disturbing it is that people don't want to acknowledge what they can see with their own eyes. The programming is simply too strong, and that is a an element in this equation that is leading us to near-term planetary omnicide. So we need that to change, and that's back to the critical mass of awareness. In regard to your other observations of what you see, the rippling effect, the herringbone effect, and some of this particulate matter layer, that's a very important question. These particles are being manipulated with extremely powerful frequency transmissions that are far more powerful than communications transmissions. And that's why we hope those that are justifiably fighting against the exposure to 5G and the rest understand that the same facilities, the same towers are being used in many cases for climate engineering operations. And we know that because we work with behind the scenes a few in that industry that are disclosing to us how much power they're supplying to some of these units, these towers. It's 10 times more than they need for communications. And we can see their effect on water vapor image loops. We can see it. And so when you have an electrically conductive particulate and you saturate the air mass with it, you then can repel those particulates, which repels the air mass, which can repel the moisture. And that's how they're steering cyclones, Richard. We captured this in real time. If your listeners search geoengineeringwatch.org hurricanes, they'll find about a half a dozen reports that actually record in real time. This is a very painstaking effort we make at geoengineeringwatch.org. Record in real time that actually you could search that even on
I'm
an
looking.
open search engine. And that link, if you showed that image, it would be very powerful to see. If you
Where?
search geoengineeringwatch.org Hurricane Ian, try that one.
Let's have a
And
look. I'm
you
just.
can go to a standard search engine.
Oh,
Just go to
okay.
Google.
Bear with me.
Go to Google.
Right.
Geoengineeringwatch.org Hurricane Ian. And if you open that video and play that would be a very profound. And Google tries to censor us. Hurricanes, there you go. Geoengineering might show up there. Google makes it very hard. I want to state that to your listeners. We were, while you're searching there, we were you might have to, what you're showing is the censorship that we've experienced. It probably would come right up on Bing. We were the top of the first page of a search on the geoengineering term. We were the top of the first page on Google up to about 2 years ago because of our traffic. Top of the first page. Yeah, we don't have a specific section for hurricanes on the home
Oh,
page
okay.
for that. What do you have right there at the top? You had something I thought. Hurricane.
I'm just looking at
That might show it
unprecedented.
right there. That might be, that's one of ours. Um, if you click a video open there you go. You should see what I'm talking about there.
The unprecedented.
I'll just turn the audio down. Let's have a look.
Okay, there you go. If you show that loop right there, I think that might have been Ian right there. When you see those blue flashes light up in that big wave,
Yeah.
those are all
Oh,
transmitted.
wow. Look at that.
That's the next rad transmitter. And what I was describing is as they energize, it has a repelling effect on the storm rotation, and it repels it. It can push the storm, and that's exactly what they're doing. These are patented processes. It should go back to that animation in a moment, or you can go back to the beginning. But that's one aspect. There you go. That's part of the NextRad network in the US that manipulates the storm. So once they get close to land, they are very effective at manipulating them because they have all these ground-based transmitters. And this technology, hurricane manipulation, Richard, goes back to 1947, Project Cirrus. That's when the U.S. military first began their hurricane manipulation efforts in 1947. How far have they come since then?
I know. I mean, and the thing is, people have absolutely no idea how long this has been going on.
None.
And then, as you say, the technology now in the space of, 80 years, 90 years, whatever it is, I mean, it just must be leaping ahead.
But it's shocking and alarming. Now, 2 more points let's add to this manipulation, because this is an important part of the subject. Again, they're saturating our air masses, saturating storms with these electrically conductive particulates, which helps facilitate their manipulation of those storms. So if we look at the Gulf of Mexico right now, the Gulf of Mexico water is astoundingly warm. In fact, Florida recorded temperatures of 101 degrees this year, killed all the coral. New articles about that in the last couple of days. So you have water that's literally as hot as a hot tub. That's the recommended temperature by jacuzzi, by the way, 101 to 102 for a hot tub. So kill all the coral with this warm water in the Gulf of Mexico, where all the oil drilling platforms are. Nothing is allowed to spin there. And there are multiple patents for hurricane suppression technologies. They're absolutely being used. So they don't allow anything to spin around the oil production. How obvious can that be?
Right.
Everything's disintegrated before it gets anywhere near those scenarios. So they're very effective at manipulating even storms of this size. And people, they simply tell themselves it can't be. And let's look at a cell phone. How many, you go back 100 years, if you told someone you could talk on a little black box to someone on the other side of the world,
Yeah.
not even connected, who would believe that? No one would believe it. And so, in the case of these transmitters, what you saw in that video was the NextRad network, and that can create the herringbone patterns that you saw. Sometimes, Richard, you'll see overlapping herringbone patterns in opposing directions, and that is indicative of multiple transmitters involved. So you have them pushing from different directions, and it creates that herringbone effect in opposing directions. Nature can't do that. You can't have opposing ripple effect in the sky. And again, the whole effect itself is not natural. But on a bigger scale, when we look at facilities like HARP, which many of your listeners might know what that is, a high
Yeah.
frequency active auroral research program that doesn't mean anything to anyone. It's meant not to mean anything. So you don't know that HARP is a weapon of mass destruction. Facilities like HARP, it's an ionosphere heater, and that's exactly what it does. It can transmit 3.5 million watts of power into the electrically charged ionosphere. It causes an electrical chain reaction, and that heats the atmosphere, pushes it up and down. The downward push creates a high pressure heat dome. Have you heard by chance, Richard, meteorologists using that term, high pressure heat dome, under these massive record heat areas? That's what creates those areas, a high pressure heat dome. Why would they do that? Multiple reasons. When you create in the northern hemisphere a high pressure heat dome, the upper level winds rotate clockwise around that, just like the pulley on a car, Richard. If you look at the
Right.
front of a car engine, the fan belt goes clockwise around some pulleys, counterclockwise around others. Imagine that being the jet stream. And by this method, creating atmospheric pressure zones, they can steer the jet stream with unbelievable success, if you want to call it that. And they're manipulating weather systems from that. So underneath that, though, underneath those high pressure heat domes, you have extraordinary temperatures like we had in British Columbia 2 years ago. Temperatures that were 60 degrees above normal. It was 121 degrees on the coast of British Columbia. Killed everything, killed all the marine life under a high pressure heat dome. So that is also another aspect of climate engineering. And I don't know what the normal temperature is in UK in the summer. Maybe you might get, I'm going in Fahrenheit, but it may be 80 or 90 degrees. Add 60 degrees to that. What if you're 150 degrees in the UK? That's the equivalent of what you had in British Columbia. It was normally 60 degrees during that window of time. They had 121. That's a massive difference. So there's so
And
much to this, so many aspects. And a final note that's important, as a tectonic weapon, when you transmit this power that HARP has, and you bounce that transmission off the reflective atmosphere with aerosol spraying, and you then push that signal back down into Earth strata in a seismically sensitive zone. Science is very clear on this. This is not speculation. You can create a reverberation in the strata, and you can trigger seismic activity. That technology and that science is very clear. So if we look at what happened in Turkey 5 days after their leader stated what he did about NATO and was pushing back, 5 days later, massive quake. Let's look at Japan and what happened there. Japan was allying with its regional partners. And I know this seems like an off ramp, but it's directly connected to all the same elements. Your listeners can search MIT, if you know, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, world renowned, MIT, atmospheric heating, Japanese quake. MIT stated on the record they recorded what they called extremely anomalous atmospheric heating directly above the epicenter for 3 days prior to that quake. Now, these dots all connect. And again, after the Japanese incident, the Japanese earthquake, Japan was right back in the U.S. hip pocket. And to add a little more credence to this, I was personal friends with General Albert Stubblebine, U.S. military general, highest ranking officer to speak out about 9/11. And what he told me was that the quake was intended, the Fukushima incident wasn't. But when you start to interfere and trigger such massive repercussions from planetary systems, bad things happen.
Yeah, I can see, and of course, we've got the cover story for all these things being we're now in the era of global boiling, which just is kind of this blanket for people who are, I suppose, hard of thinking or wanting to face the facts or think further than the end of their nose, and they go, oh yes, it's all to do with this man-made climate. Well, it is man-made climate change, they're telling you, but it's not what we think of man-made climate change. It's not their narrative, but it's certainly a man-made changing the climate, but not for good.
What I would encourage people to do, whatever their perspective on the climate or the state of the climate, is to understand and remember this, that there is no legitimate discussion about climate anything from any perspective without first and foremost addressing this issue. And it is not being addressed. In fact, we have an illegal federal gag order on all National Weather Service and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration employees. The nation's weathermen in the U.S. have a federal gag order on them. Why would that be? And the answer is obvious, but from any perspective, what I would encourage people to build bridges. We have to face this issue from people on all sides of the fence. And that's something that they really can't rationally argue with, Richard, is that there's no legitimate discussion about climate anything without addressing this first and foremost, and the various aspects of this, like the flash cool downs that are certainly from chemical ice nucleation operations, the heat domes, the same. That this is so dramatically interfering with Earth's life support systems. And if we look at that, and back to the seismic activity, just that alone, when you create massive thermal buildup from a high pressure heat dome, that thermal expansion alone can also trigger seismic activity. So again, there's so many overlapping components here, and none of them bode well for a future for any of us if it's allowed to continue. This intentional intervention with Earth's life support systems and utilization as weapons, and even with fracking, Richard, I know you know what fracking is, and
Yeah.
the fracking seismic activity as well. That is fully acknowledged by the science community. Fracking is causing earthquakes, period. And so I want people to look at the data, not conclude something's not possible because it just sounds incredible and they haven't
Yeah.
looked at it. We should have a reason for our opinions, a reason for our conclusions. And so, again, the amount of weaponry that those in power have at their disposal is truly beyond comprehension. And even look at a nuclear or hydrogen bomb. How inconceivably destructive is that? And people accept that, they know that's real. So again, there's much more technology now. It is very alarming to the degree that it holds our near-term existence on this planet in the balance.
To just to finish up, because this has been an absolutely horrific conversation, really. I mean, because of the enormity of what we've been discussing. One of the things then, clearly, people are detoxing all the time because they're breathing in this cocktail of heavy metals and toxins. And they may not realize that's what's, because the body is desperately trying to get shot of this stuff with colds and dribbly noses and things like that. And of course, maybe people are being driven to other measures, other pharmaceuticals to take to supposedly deal with it. Is there things that that one can use to try and get some of this stuff out of us? Do you have a personal regime yourself? People talk of all sorts of different solutions, like clean slate and methylene blue and various products. And do any of those really work, or is it just an endless battle?
Yes, there are methods of chelation that can help us to stay as healthy as possible while we're fighting this battle. So to weave this all together, whatever a person may think of the technologies that I mentioned and the severity of what's happening in our skies, the fact that we are breathing these elements is indisputable. I would, and I'll get to your second question in a moment. If I
Mm.
can encourage your listeners to find the brightest flashlight they can, find a dark place after the skies have been clearly aerosol sprayed, and you have those hazy skies that we now see so often. Go out in a dark place, away from light pollution, in a calm night, no wind, and aim that flashlight straight at the sky and look directly up through the beam, not sideways through it. Look directly up through it, and you have to see it to believe it. It looks like you're in a snowstorm. There's so much particulate matter coming down. Again, it's something you have to see to comprehend. That's what we're breathing. It's building up in all of us. So chelation is absolutely essential, but that must be done carefully. And I would advise your listeners to consult with a nutritionalist. If you chelate too quickly or too aggressively and you free up too many of these particles too fast, you can do more damage than if you hadn't done anything. So
Right.
it's important to do it correctly, but many of the chelating elements are essential nutrients anyway. Vitamin C, calcium. You have other elements that can work. Cilantro is good for heavy metal. Uh, to free them up, but then you need other elements to help escort those metals out of your system. Otherwise, they'll just migrate around, and that doesn't help you either. So again, a good chelation program is absolutely essential, and we do have one post on that where I put my protocol. It's called under geoengineeringwatch.org. It's called "Staying Healthy in a World That Isn't." I think that's the title. But bottom line is heavy metal chelation essential. We're all being exposed. And the polymers are another factor too, Richard. We have recent study. Your listeners, I encourage them to look this up. We have recent peer-reviewed study that states we are inhaling so many polymers. Again, that's a part of this mix. It's not just decomposing plastic in the environment. Climate engineering elements call for it. We know it's there. We're breathing so many, it's enough to make a credit card a week. That's inconceivable. And I know that sounds preposterous. I encourage your listeners to look that up. We have recent peer-reviewed study that concluded that's how much we're inhaling, and that's
My
very
God.
difficult to comprehend. But if they look up through the torch, the flashlight, and think about that with what they're breathing all day long, every single day, and ingesting, because that's
Mm.
including that as well, because this is being uptaken in food and our water supplies. So again, if they search polymers, inhaling, uh, along that subject line, they'll find more data than they want to look at. I assure you.
Yeah, and I'm, this is a silly question I'm going to ask, but I'll ask it anyway. Those people who think that the masks that they used to wear during the recent pandemic, absolutely no use whatsoever because of the size of these particles,
You're correct.
presumably. Yeah.
You're correct. Now
Um,
the only variance is that, uh, yeah, to where even an N95, if you're talking about a 10 nanometer particle, that would be like trying to catch a minnow in a tuna net. You
right.
can't do it.
Yeah.
And so, again, you're completely correct. The only variance would be some of these particles do coagulate, and that would perhaps make a big enough particle to trap or slow down. But we can't stop this. These particles
No.
float into interiors. We've tested in crawl spaces below homes that haven't been touched for 30 years, and they've migrated everywhere. They're in everything.
Yeah.
So you're completely correct. We have to deal with this, and
I,
that's why we're
I,
focused.
I only mention it because some people might go, oh, well, I'll just keep putting one of those masks on. As if, I mean, they're drinking it, they're eating it, they're going to be inhaling it. As you
Yes, they
say,
are. And you're
there
completely
is,
correct. That mask is not going to stop a nanoparticle. No.
yeah, yeah,
You're right.
no. Dane, it's been an absolute pleasure to have an update with you, although it has been very frightening, of course. But we're fighting the fight and we're trying to get the message out. And I really appreciate your time. And I hope that the viewers will go and check out geoengineeringwatch.org. Have a look at your videos, the dimming in particular. As you say, it's been cancelled in so many different places. And start taking this as seriously as we can and get that absolute global awareness of this horrific subject, and see what we can do.
It would cause a shockwave around the world. It would, if we could unite populations with the knowledge. Again, their governments have done this without their knowledge or consent. That's the pitchforks and torches moment, Richard. When people take to the streets and look for anyone and everyone responsible. A final note to your listeners: Don't feel helpless. On the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org, there's an activist suggestions link. All of us have much more power than we realize, but you have to play. We're playing chess. We have to learn to play it effectively and efficiently. And that doesn't mean running out in the street, pointing at the sky and ranting. It means share credible data with images from a credible source. Geoengineering Watch strives to be that source. We're non-political. We're completely data-based. When you share credible data with someone, that's the key to the door. And don't expect them to wake up immediately. This is a shattering of a person's perception of the entire world, of the future they thought they had. Plant the seed, move on, let it sprout. And if we keep sowing those seeds, if we stoke those fires of awareness, Richard, and we make them into bonfires that can't be put out, and we bring this issue to light, that's the biggest leap we can make in the right direction. And that effort will take all of us, but we're not helpless, and those in power aren't gods. We can yet make a difference.
Thank you, Dane, for that optimistic end to it, because I think otherwise people will just sort of bury their head in their hands and say, what's the point? And I think we do need that sense of optimism that there is a chance, and
Yes.
and all the time there is the chance. It is worth fighting.
Absolutely.
For. No, and I hope we can have a catch up in another 6 or 7 months' time. Hopefully we have some better news for people, but it's been wonderful to talk to you. I'm so pleased that you're still doing what you're doing, and my hat, although I'm not wearing one, comes off to you, sir.
Team effort, Richard. A team effort. I'm so grateful for your voice. And a final note to your listeners to consider as well. Based on psycho evaluation of those considered healthy with their perspectives, the hallmark of a healthy mind is an unyielding willingness to face the truth no matter how dire. That's what will help change this equation, and we are all capable of that. Again, and when you arm yourself with credible data, you no longer feel like you have no means of fighting this battle. We try to supply that weaponry, if you will, with our information at Geoengineering Watch. So again, a team effort. Thank you so much for your voice, Richard.
It's my pleasure indeed, and thank you. So there you are, ladies and gentlemen. Do check it out, and do plant the seed, as Dane says. I'll be back with more interviews and monologues, etc. But in the meantime, from Dane, whereabouts are you, Dane?
I'm off grid on the east side of Lake Shasta in Northern California. What was a thriving forest 15 years ago, it's now deafeningly silent. Wildlife die off, insect die off. It's the trees. It's absolutely painful to watch, but it's for those very reasons that I fight on every day, Richard.
Good man. And from me, here in Worthing on the south coast of England, thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll see you soon. Till then, bye-bye.